The sun was just beginning to set behind the rows of white picket fences, casting a golden glow over the quiet suburban neighborhood. The air was warm, carrying the scent of fresh-cut grass and blooming flowers. Birds chirped softly in the trees, and the sound of children laughing in the distance echoed like a lullaby. It was the kind of place that felt like home, peaceful, safe, and serene. David Miller leaned against the porch railing, taking in the calm of the evening. He had always loved this time of day, the stillness of the neighborhood, the simplicity of the moment. It was hard to believe that only a few years ago, he and his daughter, Sophie, had been living in a much different, chaotic world. But now, here, in this quiet corner of the city, it felt like they had found their sanctuary. Sophie, his 18-year-old daughter, was sitting on the front steps, her legs crossed as she read a book. Her long brown hair cascaded down her shoulders, and her glasses rested gently on her nose. Despite her health struggles, Sophie's spirit was unbreakable. Born with a condition that affected her mobility, she had spent most of her life in and out of hospitals, her future always uncertain. But David had made it his life's mission to protect her, to give her a sense of normalcy, even if it meant sacrificing his own happiness. David had always been a doting father. His love for Sophie knew no bounds, and his protective instincts were second nature. He was always on alert, ready to step in at a moment's notice. But it wasn't just Sophie's health that kept him vigilant. In the past, they had both endured the pain of losing everything, and David wasn't about to let that happen again. He wasn't going to let anything, or anyone, threaten their newfound peace. The neighborhood had been the perfect place for them to heal. The houses were all neatly kept, each lawn immaculately trimmed. The neighbors waved when they passed, and the kids played together in the yards, their laughter blending with the sounds of the birds and the rustling of leaves. It was everything David had wanted for Sophie, a fresh start, away from the noise and stress of their past life. But there was one constant in this otherwise perfect place: Karen Green, the president of the Homeowners Association. She was always lurking, watching from her meticulously maintained garden, waiting for the slightest infraction to impose a fine or a rule. Whether it was the wrong color of paint on the mailbox or a garden decoration slightly askew, Karen was quick to call out anything she deemed unsightly or against the rules. David had learned to ignore her petty complaints at first. But as the weeks went by, he began to realize that Karen's need for control went beyond the superficial rules of the HOA, it was personal. The soft rustling of the wind through the trees was the only sound that broke the silence on the Millers' front lawn. David stood in the garden, pulling weeds from around the flower beds, while Sophie tended to her small vegetable patch. It was one of those peaceful Saturday afternoons that seemed to stretch on forever, the kind of afternoon they'd grown accustomed to since moving here. But, as the day wore on, an unsettling feeling began to settle in David's chest. It wasn't long before the neighbor's sleek black SUV pulled into the driveway across the street. David's heart sank when he saw the all-too-familiar figure step out, the same woman whose stern glare had haunted him for weeks, Karen Green, the president of the Homeowners Association. Karen had always made her presence known. She wore her HOA badge like a crown, ready to reign over anyone who dared to stray from the meticulously curated norms of the neighborhood. At first, it had been small, almost laughable complaints, the angle of Sophie's birdbath, the color of their doormat. But now, as David watched her strut across the street in her perfect white blouse and pearls, he had a sinking feeling that today would be different. "Sophie," David called over his shoulder, "why don't you come inside for a bit? I think it's time we take a break." Sophie, sensing her father's unease, put down her trowel and glanced over at Karen, who was heading toward their front door with purpose. Sophie gave a resigned sigh. "Here we go again." David met her gaze, trying to mask his frustration. Karen had been a thorn in their side from the beginning. He knew what she was after: she thrived on control, and she wouldn't stop until she had it. As Karen approached, her heels clicking on the pavement, she wasted no time with pleasantries. "Good afternoon, David," she said, her voice sweet but laced with authority. I need to talk to you about Sophie's garden decorations. David raised an eyebrow. What about them? They're a violation of HOA rules, Karen said, holding up a small, laminated sheet of paper. The garden is cluttered with unnecessary items. We maintain a standard here, David. A simple garden with native plants would be more fitting. David's jaw tightened. He looked at Sophie, who had stepped out onto the porch to join them. Are you telling me that a few garden gnomes and a wind chime are causing a disturbance? Karen's smile faltered, but she quickly recovered. It's not just about the decorations themselves, she explained, her voice taking on an icy tone. It's about the image of the neighborhood. If we let one person bend the rules, others will follow. We can't have that. David felt a surge of anger bubble up inside him, but he kept his cool. He'd always believed in resolving issues calmly and respectfully, but Karen's arrogance was testing his limits. Sophie's garden is her project. She's worked hard on it, David said firmly. This is a small decoration, and it's not harming anyone. I don't see why it needs to be an issue. Oh, it's not just about the decorations, David, Karen said, her voice growing colder. It's about setting an example. If I don't act now, I'll be failing the other residents. Rules are rules, and they're here for a reason. David took a step closer, trying to keep his voice even. I understand your position, Karen, but this is getting ridiculous. You can't just go around nitpicking everything people do. Karen's eyes narrowed, her expression turning to one of thinly veiled contempt. You don't seem to understand, David, she said, her voice now edged with a sharpness he had never heard before. I don't make the rules, but I do enforce them. And I won't tolerate defiance in my neighborhood. Sophie, who had been standing quietly beside her father, could feel the tension rising. She wasn't the type to back down, especially when it came to her garden, but she knew that her father would handle it better than she would. She put a hand on his arm, giving him a silent warning. She could see the storm brewing in his eyes. David let out a slow breath, trying to calm himself. I'll take it under advisement, Karen. But I don't think you have the right to force us into something so trivial. Karen, sensing the resistance in his tone, pursed her lips. You'll hear from me soon, she said, her voice icy with finality. Consider this your first warning. As Karen turned on her heel and stalked back toward her house, David felt a deep frustration settle in. This wasn't just about the garden anymore, it was about power. And Karen was just getting started. The morning sun cast a warm glow over the front yard, the soft hum of bees and the rustle of leaves providing the only soundtrack as Sophie knelt by her garden. The colorful decorations she had painstakingly chosen, an assortment of painted garden gnomes, delicate wind chimes, and vibrant flower pots, stood proudly against the backdrop of the picket fence. To Sophie, the garden was more than just a hobby, it was her sanctuary, a small escape from the stress and pain that had often defined her life. But this morning, as she tended to her plants, she knew it wouldn't be long before Karen showed up again. The tension that had been building between her family and the HOA president had been simmering for days. And when Karen's black SUV pulled into the driveway across the street, Sophie knew the confrontation was inevitable. David, working on his car in the driveway, didn't seem to notice the car's arrival. He was too focused on tightening the bolts under the hood. Sophie wiped her hands on her gardening gloves and stood up, glancing nervously at her father. She could see Karen in her rearview mirror, staring at their yard with disdain, as if calculating her next move. As Karen's heels clicked on the pavement, Sophie braced herself. She had no intention of backing down this time. This garden was her piece, her creativity, and Karen was not going to take it from her. David, Sophie called, walking towards her father with a determined expression. Here she comes. David looked up just as Karen approached, her smile as tight as her perfectly pressed blouse. Good morning, David, Sophie, she said, her voice dripping with faux politeness. Sophie crossed her arms, standing tall as Karen approached. "What's it this time, Karen?" she asked, trying to keep her voice steady despite the rising anger inside her. Karen glanced over at the garden, her eyes narrowing. "I've been very patient, Sophie, but this," she gestured toward the decorations, "is getting out of hand." "You've been warned before." Sophie's jaw tightened. "I'm not taking them down," she said firmly. "This is my garden. I like it the way it is." Karen's face twisted with a cold smile. "You don't get to decide what stays and what goes in this neighborhood. The HOA has rules for a reason. I'm just trying to maintain some order around here." Sophie felt the heat rise in her chest. She had spent hours picking out the decorations, painting each one by hand, and Karen was standing there like it was just a pile of junk. She wasn't going to let this woman ruin something that meant so much to her. "No," Sophie said, taking a step forward. "I'm not going to remove them. You don't own this neighborhood. This is my home, and these decorations make it mine. If you don't like it, then maybe it's time to move on." Karen's eyes flicked to David, as if expecting him to step in and defuse the situation. But David was standing quietly by, watching the exchange with a look of quiet understanding. He had always backed Sophie when it came to matters of fairness. He wouldn't stop her now. "You're being unreasonable, Sophie," Karen snapped, her voice turning icy. "And if you don't remove these decorations, I'll have no choice but to fine you again. You've been warned. The HOA won't stand for this defiance." Sophie stood her ground. "I'm not going to let you push me around anymore. I've done nothing wrong. You're the one who's abusing your power." Karen's nostrils flared with frustration, and she took a step closer to Sophie. "You think you can get away with this? You're a child. You don't know what's best for this neighborhood." "Maybe I don't," Sophie shot back, her voice steady now, "but I know what's best for me. And this garden makes me happy." Karen's gaze shifted to David, the smug expression on her face turning into one of thinly veiled contempt. "You should control your daughter, David. I'm giving you one last chance to make things right before I take this further." David, who had been watching the exchange silently, finally spoke up. "Karen, we've been through this. Sophie's not taking down the decorations. If you want to push this further, go ahead. But we're not backing down." Karen's eyes narrowed dangerously. "You'll regret this, David. I'll make sure of it." She turned on her heel, her heels clicking loudly against the pavement as she marched back to her car. Sophie stood still, her heart pounding in her chest. She had defied Karen, and while it had felt liberating in the moment, a part of her couldn't shake the fear that this was just the beginning of something much worse. David placed a hand on Sophie's shoulder, squeezing gently. "You did the right thing, kiddo." Sophie nodded, but the unease still lingered. She knew Karen wasn't the type to let things go. Whatever was coming next, it wasn't going to be easy. But for now, Sophie felt a small victory in her refusal to back down. As Karen drove away, Sophie couldn't help but wonder just how far Karen was willing to go to get her way. The morning after their confrontation, the sun rose with the promise of another quiet day in the neighborhood. But for David and Sophie, peace was no longer an option. Karen Green had made it clear the previous day that this wasn't over. As the day unfolded, it became painfully clear that Karen was far from finished with them. David was in the kitchen, sipping his coffee, when the sharp ring of the doorbell broke the silence. Sophie, still groggy from the night before, looked at her father with a mix of dread and weariness. Neither of them needed to check the peephole, they knew exactly who it was. David took a slow breath before walking toward the door. As he opened it, Karen stood there, her arms crossed, a stack of papers in hand. Her icy gaze met his, and he could see the satisfaction in her eyes. "Morning, David," she said, her tone far too pleasant. "I've brought something for you." Without waiting for an invitation, she stepped past him into the entryway. Sophie, who had been sitting at the kitchen table, stood up immediately, her eyes narrowing in frustration. "What now, Karen?" Sophie asked, her voice dripping with defiance. Karen held out the papers, her smile sharp as ever. "You've failed to comply with the HOA's regulations. This is your formal notice of a fine, $200 for your garden, and an additional penalty for defying my warning. This can easily escalate, you know." David's eyes hardened. He'd been expecting something like this, but hearing it made the tension in his chest grow. "We've already been through this," David replied, trying to remain calm. "This is about personal control, not the garden. You're punishing Sophie for having a little creativity." Karen's eyes flashed, but she remained composed. "You're mistaken, David. This is about rules. And if you continue to defy them, I'll be forced to take further action." Sophie's pulse quickened, her body tense as her mind raced. "What kind of action?" she demanded, standing from the table and walking over to her father's side. Karen's smile faltered for a moment, then she straightened her back and leaned in slightly, lowering her voice to a cold whisper. "If you keep pushing me, I will report you both to the county. You think this is just about decorations? This is about your conduct. If you think I'm just going to let this go, you're sorely mistaken." David stepped forward, his voice steady but filled with an underlying warning. "You wouldn't dare go that far." "Oh, I would," Karen replied, her eyes flashing with cold certainty. "And you'd be surprised at the power I have in this neighborhood. I don't make empty threats, David. I've got connections. You'll regret crossing me. The fines will escalate, and if you refuse to pay them, I'll have no choice but to take legal action. And believe me, I won't stop until you've learned your lesson. I've made sure that your name is already flagged. The HOA's not the only one who has leverage." David clenched his fists, his anger growing, but he forced himself to remain composed. "You can't do this, Karen. It's just a garden. It's not breaking any laws." Karen's lips curled into a smile that made David's skin crawl. "The law is whatever I say it is when it comes to the HOA. And if I want to make your life difficult, I can. I'll make sure you're miserable here, whether it's through fines, pressure from neighbors, or whatever means I can legally use." Sophie stepped in, her voice trembling but determined. "You're bullying us. You're harassing us because we're standing up for something we care about. I'm not going to just take it anymore." Karen turned to Sophie, her face now colder than ever. "You don't know what it's like to deal with real responsibility, do you? You're a child, and you think you can just defy authority. Well, I'm done being nice. And if you don't fall in line, you'll see just how far I'll go." Sophie could feel her blood boiling. Her heart pounded in her chest, a mix of anger and fear washing over her. This wasn't just about the garden. It never had been. Karen's control wasn't limited to trivial rules, it was about power, and she would do anything to assert it. David, sensing the growing tension in Sophie's stance, stepped between her and Karen, placing a hand on her shoulder. "This is going to stop right here, Karen. You can't intimidate us into submission. We've had enough." Karen didn't respond at first, just stared at him with a cool, calculating gaze. Finally, she spoke, her voice low and menacing. "We'll see, David. We'll see how long you can hold out. But remember, I'm not the one who's going to break. If you keep challenging me, I'll make sure Sophie's health gets a little more complicated. I can make life difficult in ways you can't imagine." David's blood ran cold at the underlying threat, but he kept his composure. "You've crossed a line," he said quietly. "If you so much as make one more move against us, I'll take legal action myself." Karen didn't flinch. "I'll be watching, David. Don't make the mistake of thinking you're in control here. You'll have no peace until you do what I say." With that, she turned and walked out the door without another word, leaving David and Sophie standing in the silence that followed. Sophie sank back into the kitchen chair, her hands trembling as the weight of Karen's words settled over her. The threats were real. The power Karen wielded was real. David stood still for a moment, trying to control the storm of emotions inside him. Sophie's health had already been fragile, and now, the constant harassment from Karen was taking a toll on her. He could see it in the way she sat, her shoulders hunched, her eyes weary beyond her years. David knew they had to fight back, but the weight of Karen's threats was heavy, and he had no idea just how far Karen would go. But he was determined. He wouldn't let her destroy everything they had built, he couldn't. Sophie was counting on him, and no matter how intense the fight would get, he wasn't going to let Karen win. It was a day like any other, until it wasn't. The sun hung low in the sky, casting long shadows across the quiet neighborhood. David and Sophie had just finished dinner, and the calm of the evening settled over the house. Sophie sat at the kitchen table, working on a small art project she had been slowly piecing together over the past few days. David was in the living room, catching up on some paperwork, when the sharp ring of the doorbell shattered the stillness. David froze. His gut instinct told him it was Karen again, returning with more complaints. Sophie stood up slowly, her eyes scanning her father's face for clues. He hadn't said a word, but Sophie could see the tension in his posture, the weariness in his eyes. "I'll get it," Sophie said, trying to sound casual, though the knot in her stomach was growing tighter with every passing second. David followed her to the door, his hand instinctively reaching for his phone in his pocket. Something about tonight felt different, a sense of unease creeping up his spine. He knew Karen wasn't done with them, but he wasn't expecting what would come next. When Sophie opened the door, Karen stood there, her face a tight mask of control. There was no pleasantry in her greeting, no attempt at civility. "David," she said coldly, her voice thin and sharp. "Sophie." David stepped forward, his arms crossed. "Karen, we've already been through this. We've told you we won't remove the decorations." Karen's lips twisted into a smile, but it was the smile of a predator. "This isn't about the garden anymore, David," she said, her voice lowered. "You've made this personal." David's stomach tightened. Something about her tone, the glint in her eyes, it wasn't just a threat anymore. He stepped in front of Sophie, instinctively shielding her from whatever Karen had in mind. "Listen, Karen," David said, his voice firm. "We've told you everything we need to say. You've crossed the line, and I'm not going to let you push us any further." Karen's expression flickered, the calm facade dropping for just a moment, revealing something darker beneath. She took a step closer, her eyes narrowing. "You think you can defy me and get away with it? You have no idea who you're dealing with." David's heart pounded in his chest as Karen's hand slowly slipped into her jacket pocket. A chill ran down his spine, and for a split second, time seemed to freeze. Before he could react, Karen pulled out a small, black handgun, her hand steady as she aimed it directly at Sophie. "Karen, don't!" David shouted, his voice sharp with panic. He reached out as if to disarm her, but before he could move, Karen's finger squeezed the trigger. The sound of the gunshot was deafening. A single, sharp crack that shattered the air and made the world around them feel like it was spinning out of control. Sophie's body jerked backward, her chest heaving as she crumpled to the ground, her breath coming in ragged gasps. David's world tilted on its axis. The room seemed to close in around him, the blood rushing to his ears as he looked at Sophie lying on the floor, her hand instinctively clutching at her chest where the blood seeped through her shirt. "Sophie!" David cried, dropping to his knees beside her. His hands shook as he tried to staunch the bleeding, the fear coursing through him like an electric shock. The sight of his daughter, the light in her eyes dimming, shattered him. Sophie's breath was shallow, her face pale as she looked up at him, her lips trembling. "Dad. I'm okay," but David could see the truth in the way she was struggling to breathe, the color draining from her face. He pressed harder against the wound, trying to stop the bleeding, but it was clear they were running out of time. "You're not okay, Sophie, hold on." David's voice broke as he fumbled for his phone, dialing 911 with trembling fingers. His mind was a haze of panic, each second feeling like an eternity. 911, what's your emergency? There's been a shooting. David's voice was frantic, his chest tightening as he struggled to speak clearly. My daughter's been shot. Please, you have to hurry, she's losing too much blood. The operator's calm voice on the other end was a stark contrast to the chaos unfolding in the room. Sir, stay calm. Help is on the way. Can you tell me the location? David snapped his head toward the window, still hearing the faint sound of Karen's footsteps retreating into the distance. We're at 22 Birchwood Lane. Please, hurry. Sophie's eyes fluttered, her breath shallow, and David's heart squeezed in his chest. Stay with me, sophomore, don't you dare close your eyes. Sophie's hand weakly grasped his, her grip so faint he almost didn't feel it. Dad. I'm scared, she whispered, her voice weak, barely audible. I know, sweetheart. I'm right here. I'm not going anywhere, David said, his voice cracking as he tried to hold back the panic threatening to swallow him whole. The minutes stretched on, each one feeling like an eternity. David watched helplessly as Sophie's breathing became slower, more erratic, each exhale a painful rasp. He couldn't let her die, he couldn't lose her. He refused to. Outside, the faint sound of sirens could be heard, growing louder as they neared. But with every passing second, David felt the weight of Karen's actions hanging over them, her cold, calculated move to harm Sophie. She had crossed a line he hadn't imagined possible, and now, his daughter was fighting for her life because of it. Sophie, please, David whispered, tears streaking down his face as he held her hand tighter. Please don't leave me. You're the strongest person I know. Don't give up now. I need you. I love you. Sophie's eyelids fluttered, but her grip on his hand tightened for a brief moment before her body went limp, and a heavy silence descended over them. David's heart stopped. His breath caught in his throat. He couldn't tell if she was still hanging on or if it was too late. The sirens were close now, the sound of the ambulance filling the air. David's world was a blur of noise, panic, and hope. He didn't know what would happen next, or if Sophie would survive. But in that moment, all he could do was hold on to her and pray. And as the paramedics rushed through the door, taking over and trying to stabilize Sophie, David could only watch in helpless terror, unable to shake the feeling that his entire world had just been ripped apart. The ambulance doors slammed shut with a deafening finality, and the sirens wailed into the night, carrying Sophie away with them. David stood in the middle of the empty living room, his hands still trembling from the pressure he had applied to Sophie's wound, his heart a chaotic storm of panic, fear, and disbelief. The bloodstains on the floor seemed to be everywhere, as if the tragedy had seeped into every corner of their home. His mind was still reeling from the moment of the shooting, from the way Sophie had crumpled to the ground with that single, shattering shot. He couldn't get the image of her pale face, her eyes wide with shock, out of his mind. David ran his hand over his face, trying to make sense of it. Karen. Karen Green, the woman who had been nothing but an obstacle in their lives, had done this. He couldn't fathom the cruelty, the calculation that had driven her to pull a gun on his daughter. Sophie had been lying there, fighting for her life, and Karen had walked away without even a second thought. She'd shot Sophie, his daughter, and walked away as if it was nothing more than a slight inconvenience. David's chest tightened as his breath grew more erratic. The reality of what had just happened began to set in. Sophie was in critical condition. The doctors didn't know if she'd pull through. He had never felt so helpless in his entire life. The police arrived soon after, their flashing lights painting the night with their harsh, blue glow. David explained what had happened, what he had witnessed, his voice shaking as he recounted every detail. But as he spoke, he noticed the doubt in the officer's eyes. It was subtle, just a flicker, but it was there. They had questions. They didn't seem convinced that it had been self-defense, that Karen had been the instigator, the aggressor. Then came Karen's voice, smooth, calm, almost rehearsed, as she explained her side of the story. "I was just defending myself," she said. "David's daughter was violent, threatening me with those garden decorations. I had no choice but to protect myself. I feared for my life." David could hardly contain his outrage. Karen was twisting the truth, manipulating the narrative to fit her version of events. She was trying to make herself the victim. She had pulled a gun, shot Sophie in cold blood, and now she was spinning a lie to get away with it. But the police were too quick to listen, too eager to believe Karen's story. The lack of concrete evidence and the absence of witnesses left David feeling powerless. They took her statement, and, for the time being, Sophie's shooting was being treated as an unfortunate incident, nothing more. There would be no immediate arrest, no justice. David felt his world collapsing around him. This wasn't right. This couldn't be the end of it. Sophie was in a hospital bed, barely clinging to life, and Karen was getting away with murder. As the hours dragged on in the hospital, with Sophie still in critical care, David sat in the sterile waiting room, his mind racing. He couldn't let Karen win. He couldn't let her get away with this. He had to take matters into his own hands. David had been a federal agent for years. He knew how to gather evidence, how to dig deeper than what was on the surface. And right now, it was clear that he was going to need more than just his word. He needed proof. Proof that Karen was a threat, proof of her years of harassment, her manipulation, and her involvement with people and organizations far darker than just an HOA president. David started his investigation quietly, gathering information on Karen's background, looking into her past actions within the HOA, and speaking to neighbors who had been too afraid to speak up before. He learned of her connections to powerful figures within the community, the way she had been silently pulling strings for years. There were whispers of corruption, of money laundering, even ties to organized crime within the HOA that she had quietly enforced. David's blood boiled as he uncovered each new piece of information. This wasn't just about a garden decoration or petty rules, it was about power, control, and an underground network that had been allowed to thrive in silence. Karen wasn't just an overbearing neighbor, she was a dangerous woman with dangerous connections. But David knew the clock was ticking. Every day that passed without action was a day Karen could cover her tracks, manipulate the narrative further, and bury the truth. He had to move fast. In the midst of his growing fury, David couldn't help but glance at the hospital room where Sophie lay. The faint beeping of machines and the sterile, cold white walls made it hard to breathe. But he had a purpose now. He wasn't going to let Karen get away with it. Sophie needed justice. And as the hours turned to days, David quietly prepared himself for the fight ahead. He was going to bring Karen Green to her knees, no matter what it took. He couldn't let her destroy their lives any more than she already had. The war for justice had just begun, and David was ready to wage it. David sat in the quiet of the hospital room, his eyes never leaving Sophie's fragile form. The machines beeped rhythmically, each sound a painful reminder of how close he had come to losing her. His heart ached with every breath she took, each one more shallow than the last. But as much as he wanted to stay by her side, he knew he had no choice but to act. The authorities were dragging their feet. Karen Green, the woman who had shot his daughter, was still out there, walking free while his family suffered. The police had already spoken to her, taken her statement, and then moved on as if it was a simple misunderstanding. But David knew better. He knew that Karen wasn't just some petty HOA president making noise. No, she had more power, more connections than anyone could imagine. And David had something that no one else knew, something that would change everything. His fingers tightened around the edge of the chair, his mind racing. He had spent years working for the federal government, years undercover, gathering intelligence, infiltrating criminal organizations, and serving a cause much greater than himself. Most people didn't know about that part of him. They didn't know about the years he had spent in the shadows, wearing multiple faces, doing whatever it took to uncover the truth. He wasn't just Sophie's father. He wasn't just some regular guy trying to protect his family. David Miller was Agent David Miller, a trained federal agent with years of experience in investigation, surveillance, and combat. And it was time to bring all of that to bear on Karen Green. David's mind flashed back to the days when he first joined the force, his training in the field, the hours spent learning how to track people, how to gather evidence, how to piece together stories hidden behind lies. It wasn't an easy job, and it wasn't a glamorous one. But he had learned quickly how to read people, how to understand their motivations and see through the masks they wore. As much as he hated to admit it, Karen was no different from the criminals he had once pursued. She was hiding behind a mask of power, using the HOA as her personal kingdom to control the lives of those around her. But David knew that masks could be ripped off, and that's exactly what he was going to do. He reached for his phone, dialing a number he hadn't called in years. It was time to leverage the connections he still had from his federal days, to dig deeper into Karen's past and uncover what she was really up to. The phone rang for several seconds before a voice on the other end answered. Agent Miller, the voice said, the familiarity of it sending a shiver down David's spine. Hey, Mike, David said, his voice low. I need you to run a full background check on someone for me. Name's Karen Green. I need everything you can find, connections, financials, anything that might be tied to her. There was a pause before Mike responded. You sure about this? I thought you were out of the game. This could get messy. David's grip on the phone tightened. I'm not out of the game, Mike. I'm not done yet. I need this, and I need it fast. My daughter's in the hospital because of her. I can't wait for the system to do its job. Mike hesitated. All right. I'll see what I can do. But you owe me one. I'll make it right, David promised, hanging up without another word. He leaned back in his chair, his thoughts racing. Karen's facade of being a mere HOA president had fooled everyone, even the police. But David had no intention of letting her get away with what she had done. This was personal now, and he wasn't going to stop until he uncovered every secret she was hiding. Within hours, Mike sent him a report. David opened it carefully, scanning through the pages of information. What he found made his stomach turn. Karen Green wasn't just a control freak HOA president. She had ties to several high-level individuals in the community, people in power who could influence everything from local law enforcement to city officials. There were rumors of her involvement with illegal business practices, money laundering through the HOA's budget, and even more disturbing connections with organized crime syndicates that had been operating under the radar for years. But what struck David the most was the subtle trail that led back to her control over the neighborhood. She didn't just want power, she had built an entire network around her, one that was designed to manipulate and control every aspect of the lives of the people who lived there. The HOA was just a front for something much darker. David's mind raced as he absorbed the information. Karen wasn't just a petty bully. She was a criminal mastermind who had been operating under the guise of authority for years. And she wasn't going to stop until she had complete control. David's jaw clenched. He now had the ammunition he needed, but he also knew that Karen would be watching, waiting for the moment when he would make his next move. And when he did, it wouldn't just be him and Sophie's lives on the line. The power dynamics in the neighborhood were shifting, and Karen was beginning to realize that David wasn't just some ordinary father. He was an agent of the law, someone who could dismantle everything she had built. As David read through the last pages of the report, he knew what had to be done. He had to take action, and fast. He couldn't allow Karen to have any more power over them. He wasn't just going to fight for justice for Sophie. He was going to bring Karen down, piece by piece, and expose her for the criminal she truly was. David stood up, his mind made up. The fight had just begun, and he wasn't going to lose. Not this time. David stood in front of the green residence, his hand resting on the doorbell. The cool evening air seemed to echo with the weight of what was about to happen. He had gathered everything he needed: evidence, connections, and a plan. But the confrontation with Karen Green, the woman who had shattered his world, would be anything but simple. His heart raced as the door swung open, revealing Karen standing in the doorway. Her expression was as cold and calculated as ever, but David could see a flicker of something, nervousness, perhaps. She hadn't expected this. Well, Karen said, her voice dripping with sarcasm. David Miller. I didn't think I'd see you again so soon. What's it this time? Another complaint about my garden? David stepped forward, his gaze unwavering. It's not about the garden, Karen. It's about what you did to my daughter. You shot her. Karen's eyes widened, but she quickly regained her composure. Don't be ridiculous. It was an accident, David. You can't just keep accusing me of things without proof. David didn't flinch. It wasn't an accident. You shot Sophie in cold blood. You pulled the trigger without hesitation. And you walked away like it was nothing. He pulled out a folder from his bag, flipping it open to reveal a series of documents and photographs. Evidence, he said, holding them up for her to see. Photos of your connections to local crime syndicates. Documents outlining your illegal activities within the HOA. And this, David added, slamming down a piece of paper, your unregistered firearm. A gun you used to threaten and harm my daughter. Karen's face paled, and for the first time, David saw something other than her usual smug confidence. It was fear. Fear that the walls she had carefully built around herself were beginning to crumble. You think this is going to scare me? Karen sneered, her composure slipping. I'm untouchable. You have no idea who you're dealing with. David leaned in, his voice low and dangerous. I know exactly who I'm dealing with. You're a liar. A manipulator. And a criminal. I've been digging into your past, Karen. Your little empire of control is about to fall. Karen stepped back, her gaze flicking nervously around, as if looking for an escape. You can't do this. You have no power here. The HOA has always been my domain. And if you think you can take that from me, you're wrong. David's jaw tightened. You've been hiding behind your position in the HOA for far too long. This isn't just about a garden anymore. This is about you abusing your power, using it to intimidate and harm the people around you. You've been playing with people's lives like they were pawns on a chessboard. But this is where your game ends. Karen's smile returned, but it was colder now. You're a fool, David. You think you can take me down with a few documents and accusations? I've worked too hard for this. I've built everything. You don't understand how deep this goes. David's eyes narrowed. I understand more than you think. And I'm not leaving here until everyone knows exactly what you've been doing. You think your connections and your threats can save you, but they won't. You've made too many enemies, Karen. It's over. Karen's face turned red with fury, and she took a step forward, her voice rising. You think you can just waltz in here and destroy everything I've built? You're nothing. Just a pathetic little man trying to play hero. I'll make sure you regret this. David's heart beat faster, but he stood his ground. You already made me regret something, Karen. You made me regret not doing this sooner. You hurt my daughter. You violated every boundary. And now you're going to face the consequences. Karen's eyes flicked to the side, and for a moment, David saw the vulnerability she had been hiding. She had relied on her power, her control, her intimidation tactics for so long, but now it was all slipping away from her. She had underestimated him, and that mistake was going to cost her everything. David pulled out his phone, tapping the screen as he spoke. I've already contacted the authorities. I've sent them everything: your ties to criminal organizations, your abuse of power within the HOA, your illegal gun. This isn't just about your actions against Sophie anymore. It's about everything you've done." Karen's face twisted in disbelief. "You think the authorities are going to do anything? They'll side with me. I'm untouchable." "You're wasting your time." David shook his head. "You're not untouchable anymore, Karen. You're just another criminal, and your time has run out." The silence between them was thick, heavy with the weight of everything that had been said. Karen stood there, her mouth slightly open, her body frozen in shock. She had no more cards to play, no more lies to tell. She had been backed into a corner, and she knew it. David could see the moment she realized it: her control, her carefully constructed empire, was slipping. She was no longer the puppet master. She was the one being played. "You won't get away with this," Karen hissed, but the venom in her voice no longer had the same force. Her confidence had crumbled, and she was now just a woman who had pushed too far, taken too much, and was about to lose everything. David's voice was steady, unwavering. "No, Karen. You won't get away with it. Not this time." For a moment, they stood in silence, the weight of the confrontation hanging between them. Karen's mask of power had shattered, and all that was left was the truth. A truth that David was determined to expose. With a final glance at Karen, David turned and walked away, knowing that the battle had just begun, but the war was already won. David sat in front of his laptop, the glow of the screen casting shadows on his face. His mind was still racing, his thoughts consumed by the confrontation with Karen. But now, the real work began. The fight wasn't just about Sophie anymore, it was about something far bigger, something that had been lurking beneath the surface of this quiet neighborhood for far too long. He sifted through the piles of documents, emails, and photos he had collected over the past days. Each piece of evidence he uncovered painted a clearer picture of Karen Green's intricate web of manipulation. The HOA wasn't just a group enforcing mundane rules, it had become her fortress, a tool for her to control, intimidate, and exploit those around her. David's fingers flew across the keyboard as he pieced together the fragments of her empire. At first glance, it seemed like a simple, albeit overbearing, organization, regulating lawn care, garden decor, and the occasional paint color on a fence. But the deeper he dug, the more he realized it was something much darker. Karen had leveraged the HOA to manipulate local elections, pocketing funds that were supposed to go into the community's maintenance, and using her position to silence anyone who dared challenge her authority. The more David investigated, the more corruption he uncovered. The HOA wasn't just Karen's personal kingdom, it was a breeding ground for illegal activities. She had connections to local businesses, ones that were somehow always in line to receive HOA contracts. A landscaping company that never seemed to get any complaints, a contractor who always won bids for neighborhood renovations, each one tied to Karen's influence. And when David looked closer, he found that some of these businesses were little more than money laundering fronts, using the HOA's accounts to funnel cash into illegal operations. David's blood ran cold as he uncovered more about her ties to organized crime syndicates. She had made deals with criminals who operated in the shadows, offering them protection in exchange for financial gain. Her role in the neighborhood wasn't just about keeping the grass trimmed, it was about using the community's trust to fund a criminal enterprise. And the worst part? She had been getting away with it for years, hidden behind a veil of respectability. David's mind flashed back to Sophie in the hospital, her fragile form lying unconscious, fighting for her life because of Karen's unchecked power. This was no longer just about protecting his family. This was about dismantling a criminal network that had been operating right under everyone's noses. As he dug deeper, David found more names of people who had tried to stand up to Karen over the years but were silenced, either through manipulation or fear. There were threats, false accusations, and unexplained disappearances. All the while, Karen had carefully crafted her public image as a strict but fair leader of the HOA, while secretly pulling the strings behind the scenes. She had created an environment of fear, where dissent was crushed, and loyalty was bought with favors and promises of power. But what hit David the hardest was the realization that Karen wasn't just a villain. She was a product of the very system she had exploited. She had started out like many others, just another homeowner with an interest in making her neighborhood better. But somewhere along the way, she had found power, and power had corrupted her. It had turned her into someone capable of destroying lives without a second thought, someone who would stop at nothing to protect her empire. David couldn't ignore the irony. The woman who had turned his life upside down, who had put his daughter in the hospital, was also the very woman who had destroyed so many others without them even knowing it. The more David uncovered, the more personal it became. This wasn't just a fight for justice, it was a fight to stop a monster, one who had been hiding in plain sight. He knew that taking Karen down wouldn't be easy. She had built walls of protection around herself, using her wealth, her connections, and her power to keep anyone from digging too deep. But David had something she didn't: truth. And he was prepared to expose it to the world. David's phone buzzed on the desk, breaking his concentration. He picked it up, seeing a message from the hospital. It was an update on Sophie's condition. She was stable, but still unconscious, still fighting. The doctors had said it could be days before they could even predict whether she would recover fully, and even then, there was a chance of permanent damage. David's throat tightened. The anger he had been suppressing for so long surged to the surface again. He couldn't let Karen get away with this. She had hurt Sophie. She had hurt his family. And now, David would make sure that Karen would answer for everything she had done. With newfound resolve, David turned back to his laptop. He had everything he needed: evidence, connections, and a personal vendetta that burned hotter than anything he had ever felt before. He knew he would need to go public with the information. The authorities were slow to act, but once the full scale of Karen's crimes came to light, they wouldn't be able to ignore it. David began to draft his plan. He'd start with the media, expose the corruption, the criminal connections, and the exploitation of the community for financial gain. He knew Karen would fight back, but he wasn't afraid anymore. He had no choice but to take her down, no matter what it cost him. He had lost too much already. And he wasn't going to let Karen ruin anyone else's life. As the night wore on, David compiled the final pieces of the puzzle. The truth was there, laid out before him, ready to be revealed. Sophie was still recovering, but David's pursuit of justice had become a personal mission, one he would not stop until he had brought Karen Green to her knees. The courtroom was silent, a tension hanging in the air as the judge prepared to pass down the final ruling. Karen Green sat in the defendant's chair, her hands folded in her lap, her expression stone cold. She had no choice but to sit there, knowing that her reign of terror was finally over. The years of manipulation, corruption, and control had caught up with her, and now, the truth was being laid bare for everyone to see. David sat in the back of the courtroom, Sophie by his side. She had come a long way since that night, when she had been rushed to the hospital, fighting for her life. The doctors had told David that the road to recovery would be long, but Sophie had surprised them all. Her strength, her resilience, had shone through every step of the way. Her recovery wasn't without its challenges. There were moments of doubt, of pain, but she was healing, and that was all that mattered. David glanced at his daughter, her hand gripping his tightly. The bond between them had grown stronger through the ordeal. It wasn't just the physical scars they had endured, it was the emotional weight of everything they had gone through. But they had made it through the storm together, and now, they were finally seeing the light on the other side. As the judge delivered the verdict, Karen Green was found guilty of multiple charges, including attempted manslaughter, corruption, and conspiracy. The entire courtroom seemed to breathe a collective sigh of relief. David felt his heart pound in his chest, not out of anger or vengeance, but out of relief. Justice had been served. Karen was escorted out of the courtroom in handcuffs, her face a mixture of disbelief and rage. She had spent years hiding behind her power, using fear and manipulation to control the lives of those around her. But in the end, it wasn't enough. The truth had caught up with her, and now, she would face the consequences of her actions. As the courtroom began to empty, David and Sophie stood up, ready to leave. The weight of the past few weeks, the terror, the uncertainty, still lingered in the air, but there was a sense of finality now. They had fought for justice, and they had won. Sophie had a long road ahead of her, but now, there was hope. The scars of the past would never fully fade, but they didn't define them. Back at home, the neighborhood began to heal. It was as if a heavy cloud had lifted from over the community. People who had once been afraid to speak out against Karen began to emerge, sharing their own stories, offering support. The HOA was restructured, with a new board of people who genuinely cared about the community, not about power or control. The damage that Karen had caused would take time to repair, but the healing process had already begun. David sat on the porch that evening, the sun setting behind him, casting a warm, golden glow over the neighborhood. Sophie sat beside him, her head resting against his shoulder. They didn't speak much, but they didn't need to. The quiet of the evening was enough. It was a moment of peace, of reflection, after the chaos they had endured. David thought about everything that had led to this moment, the choices he had made, the risks he had taken, the pain he had witnessed. He had never imagined that something as simple as a garden would lead to the kind of battle he had faced. But he had fought with everything he had, because it wasn't just about him or Sophie, it was about protecting the values they held dear: justice, honesty, and standing up for what was right. His mind drifted to Karen, locked away in a prison cell, and for the first time in a long while, David felt a sense of peace. He had done everything he could to stop her, to expose her lies and manipulation, and now, he could finally begin to move forward. The journey had been long and painful, but in the end, they had found closure. Sophie was healing, physically and emotionally. The community was recovering, and the sense of fear that Karen had instilled in everyone was slowly fading away. David turned to Sophie, who smiled up at him, a smile that felt like the first true smile she had given in weeks. "We did it, Dad," she said softly, her voice full of gratitude and strength. David smiled back, feeling a lump form in his throat. "Yeah, we did. Together." As they sat in the fading light, David couldn't help but feel a deep sense of pride. The fight had been long, and it had cost them more than they had ever imagined, but they had prevailed. They had faced the darkness and come out stronger on the other side. This was more than just a victory, it was a testament to the power of resilience, of standing up against injustice, no matter how powerful or insidious it seemed. And as the day turned to night, David knew that the hardest part was behind them. The healing had begun, both in their hearts and in the neighborhood they had worked so hard to protect. The final message was clear: justice had been served. The power of standing up for what was right had triumphed. And as Sophie leaned her head against his shoulder once more, David knew they had done the impossible, they had taken back their peace. As the video ended, David's voice filled the screen. "If you've ever faced adversity or injustice, know that you're not alone. Stand up, speak out, and never back down. Share this story, and remember, justice will always find its way."